Cities are humanity's economic engine. Today, more than 80% of global GDP is generated by cities, and historically, when cities lead, civilizations thrive. Cities don't just grow linearly. They follow what we call, in our inaugural Quantum City paper, the power law of cities. As a city doubles in size, its productivity, innovation, and idea generation also more than double. So, what is the Quantum City? The Quantum City is an intelligent, experience-driven urban ecosystem that unlocks human and economic potential at scale. We're entering a new wave of disruption, but this time it's being driven by AI. And once again, Silicon Valley is racing ahead while many other cities have stalled, or at least taken some serious hits. We're building a network of partners to develop and scale the next generation of cities. Our goal is bold: drive 10% GDP growth in major metros for a 10-year stretch. We believe this could be the ground input for what our current Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, calls the 333 plan for rebuilding America's economic foundation. We believe this is how you grow your way out of a crisis, and we believe cities will be the platform that make it possible. But it won't happen on its own. It requires coordination between technology leaders, local industries, commercial real estate organizations, and policymakers to rethink their unique communities ground up from first principles. That's the coalition we're trying to build with the Quantum City Initiative. And this is where it begins. Hi everyone, I'm Chase Garbarino, the co-founder and CEO of HQO. Thank you all very much for coming, and big thanks to Steve and James Scott from MIT being a great partner on this, and thanks to all the speakers for participating and for those of you that traveled in. So a little bit of our background. Greg, myself, our other co-founder from our previous company, Kevin McCarthy, who's here today, we previously started a business coming out of the great financial crisis. We graduated from college in 2007. And so for young folks graduating at that time, it was a very tough labor market. We ended up developing a business that was a digital media business that was really trying to bolster innovation economies in cities that weren't San Francisco. We fundamentally believed that those local economies needed to remake themselves for new ways of work for young people all around. So we really kind of fell in love with this concept that cities are humanity's greatest product, and we've really believed that we've been solving the same problem in different forms and factors, going on 20 years now. So when we think about this statement that cities are humanity's greatest product, Harvard economist Edward Glaser, who wrote a book called Triumph of the City, described it as the absence of physical space between people. That's what a city is. I mean, they are literally where people come together to innovate, create, build, and what we think is drive humanity forward. So I like to think back, through the history of cities, whether it's Athens, Rome. You think about Renaissance Florence, the auto revolution in Detroit, what's happening in Silicon Valley with tech, media, finance, fashion in New York. You have seen, and you saw this from Steve's slides, when people cluster and there's like a kinetic energy that drives economic progress. And so we think that's a very, very powerful thing. Picture's worth 1,000 words. And so what you can see here on this slide in orange is that 50% of the GDP in the United States is produced in these small clusters. So we think moving forward, new technology always disrupts, but it creates opportunities. And we think it's incredibly important, and from what we saw again from the last technology cycle in the GFC, how do we make these things work for cities such that it works for everybody?
And what's interesting is you saw Steve's slide, and he talked about the artificial intelligence and the investments there. That slide is scary. You see the GDP growth. What's most interesting is when we look at that slide 5 to 10 years from now, you're going to see that drastically shift, and that's being driven by, obviously, the artificial intelligence, the industrial boom that's currently happening right now being built by AI. The issue that we have, though, is that many of our West cities are stuck, and it's for a couple of different reasons. Obviously, you know them: economic strain, the flight of capital and talent. We all lived this. This was widely publicized from 2020 to 2024. California and New York lost about 2 million residents. Florida and Texas gained 2 million residents. Widely publicized, Elon Musk moving to Tesla. This is obviously a significant issue. During COVID, we saw an entire generation of companies vote with their feet. They were chasing efficiency, flexibility, and freedom in the cities that they wanted to work in. Housing gridlock. Zoning paralysis meets the population pressure that we have here. US is short 4.5 million housing units. In California alone, local permitting adds 20 to 30% above construction costs. That is an insane amount of regulatory friction. It's stalling new homes, and it's an issue. We've built regulatory walls higher than some of our beautiful buildings and skylines. People are finding new doors in new cities. Disorder. Public safety and urban neglect are obviously an issue. Property crime in SF rose 17% year over year through mid-24. Chicago's downtown office occupancy is hovering about 55%, which is a drastic change, and most of that is being driven by local crime. When the streets feel unsafe, capital leaves quietly, takes jobs, families, vitality with it. Aging systems. This is about what we're going to talk about. I'm lucky enough to moderate the next panel. This is a big topic here. Infrastructure is on borrowed time. We've talked about this. 43% of public roadways are in poor or mediocre condition. We're going to hear from some incredible speakers talking about how they've already addressed that. Our physical systems were designed for the 1950s economy, and now they're buckling under this new data load. Bureaucracy, kind of an easy one. The Penn Station development, just as an example, and this is close to home because we work with one of our amazing customers, Tornado, took over 30 separate agency reviews. That's insane. We're preventing our cities from thriving. The US fell to 22nd globally in the ease of obtaining construction permits. We have world-class ideas, but we can't move fast enough on them. Those world-class ideas we talk about all the time. Smart cities. Everybody here talks about smart cities. Some of the customers that we have here, some of our friends that we were talking about last night. Smart cities. What is a smart city? Oftentimes it feels like we've gotten dumber. We're moving behind. So where has smart missed the mark?
So we think where smart misses the mark is that tech is not an outcome. Tech should be an input leading to an outcome. So I think since the beginning we've been talking about smart buildings and smart cities for several decades. I think the primary miss, at least from the start, was, what is the ultimate goal when we think about smart cities? And so as you saw from the preview video, we wrote a paper at HKO called The Quantum City. And really, we think.
Hold on, we also have a podcast.
We do have a little
plug here. We're going to have a little fun up here. That's why the two of us are doing this. Steve is much more polished. We have a podcast. This is different, though, because there's a live audience and we joke all the time. So there is a QCI podcast.
And our one listener, my mom, is here. So thank you, Mom. And she did ask, doesn't quantum mean small? So to be very clear, it does in quantum computing, but we're talking about quantum leaps into the future. And we penned a paper earlier this year called The Quantum City. And when we thought about kind of the 20 years that we've spent in this space, what I think is fascinating when you think of that list of cities that I talked about, you see these cities go through extreme growth and success when they become activated and alive. And so when you think about if we could redefine what success looks like, could you generate, and as we alluded to, our Secretary Treasury talks about this, the folks from ARK Investment have talked about the GDP growth that we're going to get from the AI boom, advanced manufacturing, and things like that. And everyone talks about it at the macro level. How do you build up to those numbers from a micro level? And it starts, as we saw from that map, in cities. So could you engineer 10% year-over-year GDP growth for 10 years? If that's the goal, what are the inputs, right? We think it needs to be human-centric, and we do think it needs to be tech-enabled. But it has to start with the output, which we think is that growth. And just as reference, at its height, Rome captured 25% of global GDP. Fast forward a little bit. The economic data is obviously not perfect, but Boston was estimated to have 4x'd in 1830, New York and Chicago 3 to 4x during the Industrial Revolution. LA 3.5x, 1920 to 1930. Singapore 4.5x, 85 to 95. Shenzhen apparently 15x from 90 to 2000. And this century, Dubai has 4x'd. So this isn't a pipe dream, but how do you bottle that up and recreate it more programmatically? And so, when we talk about the Quantum City Initiative, really, as we came out of, obviously we are a prop tech company, and after COVID and everything that's been happening with interest rates, we said there are these really big, hairy problems, and we come from a community background at our last business. How do we bring together these different voices? Oftentimes, the AI conversations are happening with only tech people in the room, and they're talking about commercial real estate issues when you think about data centers and some of the other challenges. And so the initiative, Greg alluded to the podcast, but we have an initiative, and we thought MIT is the perfect group of people to kind of bring together the intersections of groups: real estate partners, tech companies, academic institutions, investors, city officials, and obviously citizens, which we all are. So that's what the Quantum City Initiative is. This is the first event of a series of events where we're trying to bring people together to solve these problems.
And when you talk about a series of events, next year we're actually just going to be AI robots, and it's not going to be us on stage. So it'll be far less prep. I don't need notes anymore. It'll all be done by Sora. Kidding, but not kidding. Steve did a wonderful job sort of setting the stage for the panels that we have here. I'm just going to name drop some of the incredible folks that we have and weave it into the conversation. So the panel that's coming up next is City Retrofits, Legacy Infrastructure, Future Vision. You're going to hear from me, obviously, which is wonderful. You're going to hear from Dominic Endicott, Andy Doyle from Grosvenor, Kevin Mull from Bedrock Detroit, and Daniel English from Legacy Investing. The second panel, The Great Real Estate Reset, New Rules for a New Era. You're going to hear from some folks who flew a long way to be here: Majad Al-Futtaim, one of our companies, Leaseman, Takima Urban Innovation, and then JLL. And Travis has got, he promised us a wonderful session from the prep call. Wink, wink, Travis. Then you'll hear Cities at the Speed of Change. Super excited about this one. This panel is going to be a little fiery. We have MIT's Mobility Initiative, MIT's Real Estate Transition Lab, NOA, and then Brian Coop from Boston Properties.
So what is commercial real estate's role in all of this? We really think that commercial real estate is the building block of this Quantum City Initiative. I've been fascinated with how there are all of these studies, some of them out of Harvard, some out of MIT, in terms of how our physical environment can literally change our behavior. There's a litany of research behind this. But to use another analogy, if cities are living in adaptable systems, people are the atomic unit, buildings really are the molecular unit bringing people together, and commercial real estate is a critical part of the circulatory system when we think about how people move and connect. Commercial real estate developers have to work with transit partners, they have to make flow in buildings work. This is something that we really think is the physical platform that is going to be the most interesting intersection with the next technology wave of AI. And so we think that everyone in this room that's involved in commercial real estate, the work is so important, and it's been so important, and we drive these really important outcomes in ways that we haven't necessarily been able to measure in the past, and we think we're heading into an era now where we can measure these things.
We are in a unique moment in time. We talked about this last night with a handful of folks. Obviously, the COVID pressure that we had, the return to office, and hopefully this is the only time I say return to office today, and hopefully it's the only time we hear it moving forward. But it's happening. Rates are coming down. So what's next? Are we good? Are we in the clear? Is everything going to come back? Is 2026 going to be the best year ever?
Hopefully we don't. Return to office always had a branding problem. I hate that term. No one's really excited by the idea of, that's about the commute returning, right? We think what's interesting about commercial real estate conferences is we're often talking about rates, right? And we've seen rate cycles, but we think there's a much more structural change that is happening in commercial real estate that we have seen in other industries that we can learn from. And at HQO, we call this the experience gap. So very basically, on the customer side, demand side, tenant expectations change and accelerate at a pace that buildings and platform delivery cannot necessarily keep up with. And when those lines separate too far, naturally financial performance can deteriorate. And so you read in the news about flight to quality, the have and the have-nots. That's just saying that there is a segment of customers that are willing to pay up for a product that meets their needs, and then there's very little in between, right? So you can see this in this one graph. And we think this is a very structural problem. Ben Thompson coined the term aggregation theory, where he would talk about how in other industries, the old way to dominate a business was to own supply and connect it to distribution. One of the examples he gives is Disney owned films. They bought a company called Buena Vista, literally trucks, that would deliver those films to Regal Cinemas, right? Netflix came along, didn't own a single movie or show at first. They aggregated a much better consumer experience, and then they worked their way down into supply. When you think about the pressures of how people work, live, it's much more dynamic. What people are looking for is more bundled services out of their real estate experience. So this is a really structural problem that we'll hear from one of the panels about, what the downstream effects are in terms of how you underwrite and how you finance these things. But this is one of the main themes that you'll hear about. And one of my favorite authors, Joe Pine, I always reference Joe. I've been showing this slide for several years with some iterations, but you'll hear from Joe later. He wrote the book, The Experience Economy, back in 1998, and it was very prescient in terms of the transformation that industries will go through from 98 to today. It's played out time and time again, and when you think about how this applies to commercial real estate, good building and good location used to be enough, right? And what we're seeing is that as you move up into a differentiated and premium position in the market, what you have to do is really evolve into service and experiential business. And I think we've seen that play out in retail, we've seen it play out in other industries. So we look forward to hearing more about this from Joe.
Well, I got two questions for you. So over the last couple of years, we talked about experience. What is experience, right? And so talking to our customers over the last 10 years or so, experience was what? It was an app. It was an app. We had a tenant experience app, or it was what? Golf pods, golf simulators, yoga studios, and whatnot. And then on your last one, you had the experience gap. How do we measure that? How do you think about measuring that?
Well, I think ultimately what's most important in commercial real estate is downstream. You can measure it in NOI. But one of the things that we see is that we're really not measuring in this industry leading indicators that a lot of other industries have been able to measure. And to your question about experience is not an app, right? It is, when you think about a brand experience, it's every touch point with the customer throughout their journey with your product or service. And so we talk a lot about real estate experience. To be very clear, it is not a product, it's an operating model. We think that everything about commercial real estate needs to be oriented around the demand side and the tenant. And so when we think about these things, it requires a strategy. One of the things that's fascinating about commercial real estate, we talk about the idea of ideal customer profiles in our business. Oftentimes, we'll lease space to anybody, right? When we think back to those economic clustering slides, industries that cluster do better. So at that molecular unit of the building, how do we bring together more people that will benefit from working closer to one another? So what's your strategy from a tenant operating system side? How do you execute on creating value, not just up into the lease, but throughout the life cycle of the lease? How do you orient around the tenant throughout the life cycle beyond one lease, beyond one building? And then what does this mean with AI in terms of upskilling and who owns what jobs, right? Then you can start to talk about technology underneath it. But we think from an operating model, you see this in other types of businesses. Obviously, hotel is incredibly oriented around folks that come to buildings. But when we talk about real estate experience, we really talk about an operating model, not an app.
Like that. Continuing on today's programming, so you will hear, Chase was mentioning Joe Pine, so you're going to hear from him right after lunch, turning experiences into real outcomes. Should be an excellent session. Then you're going to hear from one of our special guests, a fireside chat with you and Travis Kalanick from Uber, and a handful of other things. You're going to hear about how he's thinking about reshaping commercial real estate in an exciting session. And then last but not least, capital markets panel. So where's the money going? How are people thinking about it? You're going to hear from Hula Lakeside, Goldman Sachs, Proppy, Wells Fargo, and digital rights management to round out the day. So today, the Strata, we had a small role in it. MIT had a small role in it. What is our role in today in shaping the conversation, getting folks here?
Well, our core purpose is transforming commercial real estate into an experiential platform for economic growth. We promise we won't talk too much about ourselves, but we really view our job as helping commercial real estate organizations make the transition from a transactional model to an experiential model. And one looks like a line and one looks like a cycle. And so it's a very project-based industry. And when we think about the future and when you think about what a commercial real estate platform needs to be, I think we as an industry do a very good job about talking about platform with regards to the investor side of the business. We think the demand side is absolutely critical for continuous and durable returns. How do you own a relationship across more than one lease, right? And so we talk about this as experiential landlords.
When does this shift happen? When does that happen? So legacy to experience, is that happening now? Is that next year? Is that 10 years from now? Have we missed it?
Some are further up that curve that we showed than others. And it doesn't stop, right? So we oftentimes get asked, what's the one amenity we need? That's the wrong question. How do we continually figure out the needs of our customers such that we can provide much more dynamic solutions to them in a durable way? And we're announcing this week, one of the things that's fascinating is that many real estate businesses do not have a CRM. So quickly about us, we are a purpose-built CRM for commercial real estate. And when you hear about some of the amazing things that Steve talks about out of MIT in terms of smart buildings and automation and all of these things, when you think about kind of the nuts and bolts of that and the first principles of, typically we don't even know the identities and the interests and the things that people want out of the building, right? So how do you have a system of record for the users of the building that connects to the workflows across marketing, leasing, through operations, applications for the tenants and vendors? This is really where, for those of you who are familiar with us, tenant experience needs to be broader, which is why we call it real estate experience. If we want to deliver a great tenant experience, we have to cater to all the different constituencies. And of course, we try not to hit the buzzword too much, but when you think about the data that we referenced in terms of those leading indicators, how can AI truly start to surface data that investors should be thinking about when they're underwriting? How can we start to show some of those leading indicators of how do people use the built environment? So, we've been at this for about 8 years. We're incredibly excited to hear from everybody today. And thank you all for coming. You'll be hearing from Greg a lot more. He's the MC. I do like to do a little bit of a lexicon. So if you hear Greg say BTE, that means big tower energy. If you hear any other buzzwords and lingo that you don't know, you can just call on me and I can translate. But thanks for doing it.
Thanks. See you guys in 1 minute.